Okay, welcome back. This is the second part of the lecture on urbanization and refinement. What I want to do here is to talk about some of the internal changes that took place in these cities and the kind of social dynamic that emerges as a result of the Anglicization and refinement of the principal port cities. Some of what I'll be talking about carried out into the countryside as well, not surprisingly, but I want to look particularly at the changes that happened in these cities. One of the most important changes is that the cities are where we start to see kind of a growing polarization around the emergence of social class. In the 17th century, the colonies are remarkably egalitarian societies. This is particularly true in New England, but also in other places. And even the wealthy, they don't tend to live in grand houses of the sort that we saw in the lecture on Virginia. Instead, the built environment is pretty simple, oftentimes because the people who came to America didn't plan to stay here. They wanted to make money and return to England. Well, as British America became more settled, as people, sort of the second and third generation started to think of themselves as British Americans, as people who lived here, it becomes more established, and the society itself starts to become more stratified. I don't know if we're talking about sort of the 1% versus the 99%, but there's a fair bit of tension that develops between the rich and the poor. And one of the things that we see is a very self-consciousness to the refinement that takes place, and oftentimes, not surprisingly, the most successful people in these cities, and again, here we see Benjamin Franklin on the left, were also the most successful at cultivating the air of an English gentleman or gentlewoman. And you can really see this from the portraiture of the period. On the left, we see Benjamin Franklin. Chances are, if you've seen a painting or a depiction of Franklin, it'll be the Franklin on the right that you're familiar with. That actually was done while Franklin was in Paris during the American Revolution. When he was in Paris, he quickly realized that the French assumed that Americans were all backwoodsmen, sort of, like Daniel Boone or something. And so Franklin took to wearing a fur cap and sort of played the part. He was a great actor. He sort of knew that's what the French public wanted, and all part of trying to get France to recognize the United States. If he had dressed like that in Philadelphia, though, he would have been mortified. The way Franklin wanted to be seen is how he's depicted on the left, wearing a fine wig, a handsome man wearing a very expensive overcoat with fine sort of gold embroidery, reading papers, and and his sort of statue off in the background. That's how Franklin wanted to be seen. Here we see another example of the way in which this Anglicization played out. This is actually from the Boston MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts. If you've been to the Copley Room in that museum, you will have seen the original. It's a wonderful painting, actually a very affecting painting as well. Painted by Copley, Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Winslow. I'm not sure what Mrs. Winslow's first name was, but this is the way it's titled. And here we see the Winslows were they're influential people. Isaac Winslow was a leader in colonial politics, and it's also it's a wonderful portrait of sort of a loving relationship, what we would call a companionate marriage. Winslow is the one looking out at the painter, so he's the dominant figure. But Mrs. Winslow does not seem to be necessarily in a conspicuously subordinate position either. I mean, she is playing second fiddle, but it's important. So we'll talk a little more about some of that later on in the course. What I want to point out here is that it's a little hard to see in this painting, but her dress is not of the same quality as the rest of the painting. The reason for that is that the Winslows were loyalists. And this painting, done in 1773, 2 years after it was finished, they had to flee Boston for London. And on the voyage back to England, or over to England, they're native to Massachusetts, Mr. Winslow dies. And so Mrs. Winslow, she shows up in London, and this painting is one of the few things that she has to remember her husband by. The problem is her dress was not the latest fashion. So she goes and finds a painter in London who will repaint her wearing the latest fashion, which he does. The problem is that painter was not Copley's equal, and if you see the original, you can see that the dress that he's painted in doesn't have the fine brushwork or painterly skill that Copley had. And so, in fact, I mean, I don't know if she ruined the painting. It's good enough to hang at the MFA. But it's certainly not the painting that Copley did. What that tells us, though, is that, again, I talked last week about the anxiety that came from this Anglicization. The cities were where you went. If you wanted to have your portrait painted, this is where you're going to go. And that's where you're going to find the latest fashions. But you might not be up to the latest fashions. Of what's actually going on in London. And Mrs. Copley gets to London, she realizes that her dress was out of fashion, so she gets it repainted. She wouldn't have done that if this is a confident, secure society in that regard. Well, as people like the Winslows acquired greater wealth, the ability to build fancy houses, and their fancy houses being built in the cities as well. If you walked around the port area of Portsmouth, you may well have seen some of these buildings and houses. The example of what the really wealthy merchants and in some cases planters who had houses in town, actually in Portsmouth they're all merchants, could build. Another thing that happens is that there are growing numbers of poor town inhabitants who can't afford that. And cities tended to be sites of growing tension between rich and poor. And one of the things that we'll see as we look at the response to British taxation during the 1760s, that oftentimes these tensions erupted into the open with sailors and dock workers and artisans, sort of people who don't quite have the kind of wealth that the Winslows had. Rising up, taking out their resentments on the wealthier members of society, oftentimes targeting particular political figures who seem to be benefiting from the new taxes. And so there are times when the resentments that developed in these cities actually became a kind of driving force in the resistance to British taxation. And one particular flashpoint that developed over the course of the 18th century was the impressment by the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy manned its ships throughout the British Empire, did this in England and Scotland and Ireland as well, by forcibly seizing able-bodied sailors, sometimes off ships, sometimes from the actual waterfronts. And here we see, again, we've already seen this engraving of Philadelphia, but sort of the port side area of Philadelphia was exactly where you would have expected the Royal Navy to operate. And they didn't tend to target people like the Winslows or Benjamin Franklin. Instead, they targeted the poor. And there were probably before the Revolution, the most violent responses to the British government involved anti-impressment riots. In Boston in 1748, the city was paralyzed for 3 days by riots over the attempt by Admiral Charles Knowles, commander of a British flotilla that had sailed into Boston Harbor, and attempted to recruit or to replace sailors who had either deserted or died on board his ship, with fresh recruits from the port of Boston. And the Boston crowd responded by actually seizing some of Knowles's officers. They burned a ship on Boston Common, a little sort of a dory that they mistakenly thought was a Royal Navy barge. Actually, it was just a private ship. They broke the windows of the Boston State House, the old State House building, which still stands, and they even threatened the governor of the colony. And at the height of the violence, Knowles actually threatened to turn his cannons on the town if order wasn't restored. That the order was restored, so the crisis passed. But there were also riots, serious riots in New York, unrest in Philadelphia. So that there's a history of tension that develops sometimes between colonial elites and the colonial sort of poor or working poor, but also sometimes focused on British officials. Now, before the 1760s, these didn't carry wider ramifications, but certainly there is a history of protest and unrest in these cities that would play a crucial role in the coming of the American Revolution, the imperial crisis. Another set of tensions between, sort of within the towns, involved the tension that came from the religious diversity of their inhabitants. And even Boston, which is overwhelmingly congregational, had been founded by the Puritans, by the mid-18th century, is religiously quite a diverse place. And this is even more so in New York and Philadelphia, where there's really no majority. At least in Boston, the Congregationalists are still in majority. And it's not surprising. This is where because they're mercantile centers, merchants themselves, they travel freely, and people could move into these towns, not necessarily from the outlying hinterland, but from other places. In Newport, Rhode Island, there's even a significant Jewish population. Truro Synagogue, one of the oldest Jewish congregations in the Americas, is based in Newport and has roots going back to the colonial era. So that there's a small number of Jewish, a small and somewhat growing Jewish population in British America. They're overwhelmingly urban. Well, one of the biggest religious tensions that tended to develop in the cities during the 18th century was the tension that developed over the growing Anglicization of sacred space. And you can see this most clearly in what happened here in New England, where the very simple Puritan churches of the 17th century, and we see a good example in the upper left-hand corner here, increasingly began to take on some of the attributes of refined Anglican churches from England. And the most important of those refinements was the steeple. Now, today we think of the sort of the white clapboard congregational church with a steeple on a town common or maybe on the hill, as it is here in Durham. If you drive in and out of Durham on Route 4, you pass the Congregational Church of Durham, the Community Church of Durham. We think of that as a classic New England church. In fact, that steeple was an innovation, and it was one that a lot of Puritans had grave reservations about. And again, if you look at the church in the upper left, you can see just how simple the meeting houses that the Puritans built for themselves in the 17th century were. By contrast, look at the church down in the lower right-hand corner, Brattle Street Church in Boston, built in 1699. It is the first congregational church to have a steeple. And steeples were what Anglican churches had in the 17th century, and also what Catholic churches had. And to the Puritans, and there still are Puritans around, so at least second generation, who see this happening, this is not an entirely welcome development. But it nonetheless is a development that became very widespread in the congregational churches of New England, which are the successors to the Puritan church. And it's a sign of the extent to which this attempt to mimic things English even began to change the way in which British Americans worshipped. If the Puritans, who of course had come to New England in the 17th century to be different from the Church of England, if even they begin to model themselves on the Church of England, it's a sign of just how powerful this pull toward Anglicization was. And another sign of this is that the Church of England itself, on the eve of the Revolution, was the largest and most dynamic and rapidly growing Protestant religious community in British America. It made major inroads up here in New England, so that a lot of the first Anglican churches that are built in New England are built in the colonial ports. In Portsmouth, the Wentworth family, who were Benning Wentworth as governor of New Hampshire, they had originally been Puritans. They convert to Anglicanism and join the Church of England. Benjamin Franklin, raised in born to Puritan parents, brought up as a Congregationalist as a young boy. In Philadelphia, he chooses to worship in a Church of England that is built in Philadelphia. So, there are other reasons behind this as well, but a lot of it had to do with the tremendous magnetic pull of this English anglicized model. And when you get people like Franklin or New England, converting to Anglicanism, that is the Church of England, or as we would call it, the Episcopal Church, and then congregational churches themselves trying to mirror and model themselves architecturally on the Church of England. It's a sign of just how thoroughgoing this Anglicization process. And one of the things we're going to see when we talk about the Great Awakening, which is what we'll be talking about next week, is that as with sort of the relations, the crowd action against the Royal Navy impressment, this refinement and Anglicization of North American or British American religion was not universally greeted as a positive thing. And we're going to see next week that a lot of the Great Awakening that swept the colonies starting in the late 1730s and into the 40s, 50s, and even 60s, oftentimes there's a kind of anti-refinement undercurrent within that. And I'll bracket that and leave the fuller discussion of that until next week. But it is something to keep an eye on, that even as churches like Brattle Street, congregational churches, become more refined, there were always people who resisted that. And so this actually ends up oftentimes opening up tensions within the great religious denominations. And again, we'll talk more about that next week. Okay, well, the final area of tension as a result of this involved tensions between the towns and their rural hinterlands. And I've already talked about, sort of hinted at this. Some of the most, partly this is because power was concentrated in these cities, and so there's a lot of resentment. But there also tend to be there's some very famous political acts of protest that sort of pitch the eastern elites, if you will, the oligarchs who control these cities, against leaders in the rural hinterland. One of the most important of these, and certainly one of the bloodiest, involved the Paxton Massacre of 1764. And here we see two images of the Paxtonites on this screen. One in the upper left-hand corner is taken from a 19th century lithograph. The one in the lower right is actually a contemporary engraving taken in 1764. And the issue at stake here was the Paxton Massacre happened in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, a lot of the tension between Philadelphia and its outlying hinterland centered on the fact that the Quakers, who controlled Pennsylvania politics, are in charge in Philadelphia, were Quakers. They're pacifists. And as a result, they did not take an active role in defending their colony during the British wars with France in the mid-18th century, and I'll talk more about those in a couple of weeks' time. Now, for Philadelphia, this wasn't it wasn't as big a deal as you might think. In fact, the Philadelphia merchants tended to benefit from this. They were protected by the Royal Navy, whether they took steps to defend themselves or not. And actually, they oftentimes benefited from times of war because they're able to forego the cost of paying for their own defense, and instead they make a lot of money in trade. And these wars tended to be a time when British merchants did quite well. Well, it was very different in the western part of Pennsylvania, where Indians, oftentimes backed by the French, staged raids on the frontier settlements. And out in the frontiers, there aren't a lot of Quakers. Instead, there are a lot of Scots-Irish settlers, that is, Protestants from Ireland, and who have a long martial tradition. A lot of them had served in William's wars in Northern Ireland after the Glorious Revolution, or their ancestors had, and they don't share the Quakers' pacifism. And there's a lot of resentment over this, and it boils over in 1764 when a group of Scots-Irishmen from the town of Paxton, the so-called Paxton Boys, massacre a group of Indians who were under the protection of the British Army in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is out in, at that point, is right on the frontier, and start to march east toward Philadelphia. Eventually, the uprising is put down, but for a brief moment, it looked as though the Paxton Boys would actually capture Philadelphia and possibly take vengeance on the people of Philadelphia as well. Benjamin Franklin played an important role in kind of brokering a peace with that. But it's a sign. I mean, the Paxton Boys, it's indicative of all sorts of other things, and we'll talk about some of that. You know, the importance of this French and Indian warfare. We'll talk more about that in a couple weeks' time. For now, it's indicative of the kinds of tensions that tended to exist between the towns and the western settlements. And in fact, one of the things that we're going to see, even after the Revolution, these east-west tensions are probably the most important regional tensions that beset British America, and they persist into the period after the Revolution. As we're going to see, that continues to be a big problem in American politics as late as the early 1800s. It wouldn't be until the 1820s that people would start to think of the major tension as being one between North and South. Instead, the tension is between East and West, and it has a lot to do with the growing power of these cities, the tensions that develop not just within them over disparities of wealth and class and these religious disparities, but also the disparities and tensions that developed between East and West. Okay, well, I'll wrap the lecture up in part 3, where I'll talk just a little bit about the role that the cities played in the coming of the American Revolution. But this ends here, so please go to that in order to see the rest of the lecture.